Welcome to App School. My name's Steve. We're going to be having a conversation today about GitHub Actions with our guest speaker, Laguna. Laguna, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Jimmy. I'm a technical support engineer for a company called Appsmith.
What does Appsmith do?
Appsmith builds a low-code platform so that you can build internal tools for your company quicker.
Oh, that's kind of neat. So, it's kind of like a drag and drop interface that allows you to plug in little bits of code to sort of glue things together. Is that kind of the idea?
Yep, that's exactly right. Drag and drop UI. You can do the code behind. We've got data source integrations and whatnot.
Cool. So you were talking about team management strategies, and we sort of got on this tangent about GitHub Actions that sort of inspired this conversation. You want to talk a little bit briefly about, what we were discussing previously with team management and trying to organize a ragtag team together and to be a useful organization?
Yeah. Well, a few of the guys on the team haven't really worked in a team and software before, and so they're familiar with Git but not familiar with feature branching and things like this and the different ways that to make squash commits and not merge commits and so on and so forth. And so I wrote up a doc for them. I don't remember how we started talking about GitHub Actions.
So the way that we got there was I actually asked you about CI/CD. I asked if you were taking advantage of any CI/CD features, and you said something about how you were using a template, and when you forked it, it came with some GitHub Actions by default. I think is that where we started?
Yeah. And I've seen GitHub Actions used to great effect in other repos I work with. The Appsmith repo makes good use of it, of course. But I haven't seen the need to apply it in most of my projects. But I think that's mainly because I don't really know what all you can do with it or why you would do those things.
Yeah, so
I just don't have a lot of exposure.
I think for context, the answer that I gave around the team management stuff, we talked a little bit about different leadership styles and having senior leadership available and active in participating in the growth in the specific instruction for more junior folks. So that's critical, but we're going to jump over that because I kind of want to talk about GitHub Actions. And there's actually the reason we ended up talking about CI/CD and GitHub Actions is because there's a lot of overlap. And I think it's kind of interesting that you mentioned that you have lint as part of your GitHub Actions that came with this repo that you forked. Is that what's going on?
Yeah, I like to enforce the style guide.
So linting is actually one of those things that can be a really useful tool in this larger pattern that you're talking about. I mean, let's first get past the part where your engineers aren't using Git in the right way. I mean, that kind of stuff, I think that those kinds of problems are going to get resolved by your senior engineers, your engineering leadership being active and engaged in the pull request process, right? Making sure that these folks are posting PRs from their own branches into the correct branch and then making sure those get merged in the right way. But there's more to it than that. There's also, code styles, syntax styles, right? And that's really what ESLint or other linting tools are all about. What language is your project in?
TypeScript.
Okay, so you're probably using ESLint. Do you mind sharing, do you happen to know, what specific tools you're using for those?
Yeah, we are using
linting. Okay. Do you happen to know what your ESLint RC looks like? Is it like a default TypeScript thing, or do you guys have a bunch of custom stuff?
I have a bunch of custom stuff because I'm an opinionated developer.
It kind of seems like you're making a joke about that, but I think that's actually a really good way to go because what ESLint is a fantastic tool for, encoding
it's
your
not
styles.
Consistency. Any code file should just be innately familiar, and anything that we can do to increase that sense of familiarity is good, I think.
One of the things that I have said for a long time as a career professional is that consistency equals quality, right?
Yes.
So, consistency is an aspect of quality. I think that's exactly the kind of thing that GitHub Actions are useful for, but there's some other things I wanted to bring your attention to that GitHub Actions are going to enable for you that will also help with this. So the first one I'm going to recommend is builds. And when I say builds, I mean, let's say that you're building building an API, for example, and your API is a TypeScript Node.js program, and you plan on delivering it to your infrastructure via a Docker image. Well, let's have the CI/CD pipeline build your Docker image, and when it's done building it, let's have it automatically publish it. Right, so that from your wherever you're deploying your network, you can just pull the latest development image from your registry, and that can all get taken care of automatically for you in the builder. It also allows you to do things like when you do the build, it requires you to go through the build process, and the build process will often reveal errors in the code. So just by virtue of the fact that you're running, let's say, npm run build or npm build or whatever kind of build script you're going to run, if it fails to go through that build process successfully, a non-zero error code in your GitHub Actions should cause the build to fail, and that will at least give you visibility into where and when your builds have been broken. So that's the first one. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Indeed. Well, we're also currently checking for builds too, and yeah, that's why, because we want to make sure it passes before we merge. But we're not doing anything but building it. We're building it to see if it builds. I didn't know you could have it then put that places. That's really cool.
Yeah, so in CI/CD land, one of the concepts that a lot of people, well, I'm not going to say a lot of people don't know this. I think people who work a lot with CI/CD know this. There's this concept of a build artifact, and a build artifact is anything that gets produced as a result of the CI/CD runner running. So examples of build artifacts include, but are not limited to, a Docker image that you built for your application. That's a build artifact. But let's say that you have some kind of unit tests in your code, and you're running unit tests and you want to check to see what your code coverage was, to see how much of your code was actually executed when you ran those unit tests. And maybe you have that produced as a JSON file, right? Well, that JSON file is also a build artifact. You see what I'm saying?
Oh. Yeah.
Maybe you've got a markdown file in your GitHub project, and you want that markdown file to be automatically uploaded to an S3 bucket as a PDF document. So as part of your build script, you run a script that consumes that markdown file, renders it to HTML, then spits out a PDF, and takes that artifact. That's a build artifact, and you can do whatever you want with it at that point, right? So you can really write scripts for whatever you want to do. You can take a Docker image and upload it over here. You can take a PDF and upload it over there.
That's really amazing. I didn't know you could do all of that.
So I mentioned already, you can do your builds in GitHub Actions, and you can use that to validate your code to make sure that your software is building properly. You're already doing that. You can take those build artifacts and upload them in cool places. We just talked about that.
Right.
The most common things that I usually see people do besides that are, we touched on this briefly, unit testing, and there's various different levels of testing, and I think that, a topic for a later date would probably be choosing the right kind of testing and the right level of testing for what you're building, because there's a whole art to that, but generally speaking...
I definitely need to learn.
Well, the best way to learn is by making decades worth of mistakes.
Well, I think what we need to do is just have more episodes of this podcast.
Yeah, sure, let's do it. So the various different types of testing that you're generally going to do are going to be unit testing, functional testing, integration testing, probably not in that order, and then potentially automated testing. And you can do all of those things in your actions. So, for example, let's say that you're building an API, right? You can have an engineering team who does nothing but write Postman scripts and Postman assertions all day long. And then you can actually run those Postman tests and those Postman assertions inside a GitHub action against your API. So take that Docker image that you built in step 1 and then spin up an instance of your API inside the build environment, and then run all those Postman actions against that API and see if it actually passes, right? You can do really cool stuff like that too.
Indeed.
So the last stage is what I usually like to refer to as the verification stage. Everything up until this point has sort of been, build and test. The third stage I usually like to do is verify. And in verify, you can get really interesting because you can implement like vulnerability scanners and static and dynamic code analysis tools, and stuff like that. And integrate third-party integrations that can test your application in various different ways. And so in the verify stage, you can get really creative with a lot of whatever it is that you're looking for off the shelf. And then in the final stage is usually what I usually do, publish, which is what I was talking about previously, where we take all these build artifacts for these things that got created along the way, and we just publish them to different places.
But surely you wouldn't want to do that for every commit.
That's a good question. Knowing when to execute what is really dependent on how long those things are going to take. And
wait, can you control where it's executed?
Absolutely.
Can you make it only happen on merge and so on and so forth?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things you can, oh man, there's so many things you can do. Wow.
Like, where else can you execute actions other than commit?
You can set up actions to execute on commits, and that's by default. They will do every commit, but you can also set them up to only execute on certain branches. You can set them up to only execute under certain conditions. I'm not exactly sure what all of those conditions are off the top of my head. The way that I usually use this is, let's say that we have some GitHub Actions that take like 40 minutes to run, but they're really valuable, right? Like, let's say that they're like the QA automations. We literally paid a QA team to create these automations, and we want them to run, but they just take forever. So instead of running them on every commit, we only run them on commits for branches that start with release. So that way, when our developers are doing our work, we're continuously merging into the development branch. And then when we're ready to cut a release, we do a cherry pick of all of the different commits into that release branch. And then once the release branch is ready, we run, at that point, we run all of the automations against them, right? And so that ensures that big, long 40-minute test only runs against commits in that branch. It drastically reduces the amount of compute time that is necessary to, for our regular ongoing operations. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And I know that there are other ways and other conditionals that you can use to choose when different parts of your build are going to run. I'm not familiar with all.
I think I've heard of this. Is this Git hooks?
Yes. I mean, I'm not sure about Git hooks specifically, but you're in the right area, yes.
Okay. Just looking into that now.
So I think, in short, like, GitHub Actions are a tool, is a really powerful tool that can enable you to use your build system to enforce your standards. And you're already taking advantage of that. You're already using ESLint to enforce your standards. And that's a good thing. That's not a bad thing. You shouldn't, be overly critical of yourself for being an opinionated developer. If you're the tech lead on the project, you're doing exactly what you should be doing, which is setting the appropriate standards and creating the enforcement mechanisms by which you can, maintain those standards, right?
Right.
I think that there's just a lot that, with GitHub Actions, there's also a lot more other ways that you can do more of the same. And don't forget about the importance of having that lead technical person up front and available to, help those junior engineers and guide them through the process. Look into as well different branch security settings. Make sure that your branches are protected, that your junior engineers don't that it's not easy for them to accidentally make a bad merge directly into your main branch, right? Like, set them up to succeed, don't set them up to fail.
The repo's private on GitHub right now, so I don't have access to that feature. But we're going to migrate to Git pretty soon. We're going to set up a Git server.
Oh, excellent.
And use that.
So were there any other questions that you had around this topic that I can answer for you, or did you feel like we covered it?
I think we covered it enough for me to go in and learn more about it and know what I'm looking at.
Yeah.
I'm a lot more familiar than I was at the start. And I have some more ideas for things I'd like to implement in my repo.
Let me reiterate something I said earlier, which is I know that it might look intimidating once you get into that, .github/actions file, or I forget whatever it's stored. But it's really just, if I'm not mistaken, it's just a YAML file with a bunch of scripts in it, like bash scripts and stuff. So anything you could do on a command line, you can just copy paste directly in there, and assuming that the environment is set up properly, it should, air quotes, just work.
Nice. Okay.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me about this. I think this is a really cool topic. I would love to do more of these. So if you guys like this format, please go ahead and say something down in the comments. And Laguna, I'm going to give you a minute here. Is there anything else that you want to promote?
Not at the moment. Thanks for having me, though. I learned a lot while I was here. I'd love to come back again.
Excellent. I really appreciate the conversation. Thank you guys. Thank you for coming to App School. Have a great night. And as always, happy coding.